Welcome to our 33rd podcast. Today we'll be talking about managing change in remote or hybrid work environments. What's one thing you can do now to make your change initiative succeed in remote or hybrid work environments? Keep listening to find out.
Welcome to Harmonious Workplaces, a podcast about corporate culture, organizational change management, and workplace behavior. Harmonious Workplaces was started by independent consultants Rich Cruz, Ben Kleinman, and Cheryl Volpe to explore, challenge, and build on various organizational culture and change management concepts. It's a blend of theory and practice based on their personal and professional experiences working with companies of all sizes across various industries. If you own a business, lead a team, want new ideas about the corporate environment, or just want to listen to a group of consultants talking about how to make work more enjoyable, we invite you to sit back, relax, and dive in with us to Harmonious Workplaces.
Hello again, Harmonious Workplaces listeners. Thank you for joining us. My name is Rich Cruz. I'm an OD, it's Organizational Development Consultant, and I'm here with my colleagues, Cheryl Volpe. Hi, Cheryl.
Hi, Rich. Hi, everyone.
And Ben Kleinman.
Hi.
And we're going to be talking today about something that has been, it's been in a lot of the latest research that's been out. It's certainly been top of mind for everybody, particularly since the pandemic, but certainly before then. But talking about remote or hybrid work environments and how do we manage change within those environments, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so one of the things that listeners of our podcast will probably realize is that a lot of the things that we focus on have to do with communication and intentionality. And in our conversations, it seems like it would be very easy to say, well, just be more intentional about how you interact with people over Zoom. Or if you're in a hybrid setting, you have to be more intentional about making the people in the room and the people online feel equally included and all of that. And that seems nice, but to me, it seems a little bit too easy, a little bit glib, a little bit like, well, duh. And so I was thinking maybe we could try to dig a little bit deeper into how you can do those things, or what are some things that you can do to essentially not necessarily just be more intentional, but to make that hybrid environment or the purely remote environment work really well and succeed as well as maybe some of those years ago when you'd have these really nice water cooler moments, or, those nice interactions by the coffee pot in the morning, those kinds of things. So that was sort of what was triggering my head. Does that resonate with you both?
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You're like, no, it doesn't at all. I'm leading you all down the path of evil and doom and gloom.
Well, it's
not at all.
It's funny because the change to remote because of the pandemic was such a huge change. It probably would not have stuck if we weren't facing
if we didn't
what
have
we were
to.
facing, right?
For so long, right? If it was a week or 2 weeks, people would have been like, "Oh, thank God we're done with that." But since it stayed for years, it seemed like that was something. And I, Cheryl, you were in finance, and that's a very conservative industry. I've done a lot in healthcare, and that's a very conservative industry. Curious if you both saw as well, because in healthcare, there were a lot of people that I knew who were at very conservative companies. They said absolutely, before the pandemic, employees had to be in the office 4 days, 5 days a week. It was like 4.5 days for a consultant was pushing it, right? And so then as soon as the pandemic hit and there was no sense that anyone was coming back soon, all of a sudden, all these very conservative healthcare organizations were like, we're all in on remote. We don't want you anywhere near our facility. We don't want you anywhere near our building. We want you to be remote. And they quickly realized that you could do 98% of the stuff remotely for many workers, and those that had to be on site, obviously we're going to continue to be on site to manufacture drug or whatever. But was that similar in industries where you guys travel?
I would like to say that when I was in finance, and it's a great point that you bring up, but before we joined our call today, I wanted to remind everyone that the first remote situation was in the 90s when we were doing the outsourcing, right? And that was sort of that, like, are you telling me that I have to get work done with people on the other side of the world?
Right.
I've never met them. I can't see them. And we weren't even using Zoom at that point, right? So that was the first major cultural shift to working intensely with people that were not in your office.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And not even close to your time zone,
Not
right? I mean, you might be somewhere in the East Coast and you'd have calls with people in California. And so you had this sort of 3-4 hour difference, whatever. Or maybe you were working with people in Europe and that was sort of a known difference. But here you are having to negotiate 12, 13, 14 hour, 16 hour differences
Mumbai.
on a daily basis with your development team somewhere else or your sales team somewhere else or whatever it was.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And that trend continues, and the outsourcing is still a topic of conversation. So that's one version of remote that doesn't have an option for hybrid even, right? But not to get us too far off the topic of what we mean to get to, in that how do we manage with the return to office or not, and the hybrids and the change initiatives, because those don't go away, right? Changes.
Right. Well, I was just going to say you bring up a really good point, and it's a great analogy because we all sort of figured it out. Maybe it was a little bumpy at first, but by now, or within a few years, it seemed like every company was very comfortable working with an offshore dev team or something along those lines, and they just kind of made it work. They knew they got into new routines and new patterns, and they kind of made it work, and it was sort of the normal after a little while. So the similar thought came to me as you were talking about the pandemic and this switch to Zoom. And now it's kind of everyone does it. Everyone's used to it. Everyone is comfortable with it. Is there something different, though, about how we interact over Zoom versus those prior, I want to say, like conference calls when you had those little pods in the middle of the table and everyone's sort of like cramming around these things, and you have the person sitting in the back that nobody could hear or came through over the mic in a very soft kind of a way.
Sure.
Right. Until you got the tables where there was a mic at every seat. Just sort of
right
in there, right? So Star Trek.
Yeah.
But going specifically related to change, because change continues to happen, and now that we have the culture that we do with the hybrids and the remote environments, there are challenges with that when it comes to change, naturally.
Mm-hmm.
And so even though we are used to not being in person, the same challenges and resistance to change are still there. So how do we overcome those?
Mm-hmm. Well, when you mentioned the 90s, something that came to mind was I was watching this series, I don't know if you ever heard of it, called The Food That Made America, or Food That Built America.
We've watched them.
So it's a history channel.
They're great.
Yeah. So Mrs. Fields, the cookie company.
Oh, those were so good.
Yeah. Well, the founder, right, she didn't want a franchise. She wanted to keep everything under one roof, but she needed multiple locations. So I believe it was her husband that helped to design an intranet that used the internet, that kind of nascent technology at that time, to connect their stores so they could keep track of all the payroll and all the accounting and all of the communication throughout the organization, right? So talk about, like, every time they needed to change something, now they didn't have to go to each individual store and visit and change all that stuff. They didn't have to go to each store and monitor their quality, because everything ended up being put into this central system. And I'm not sure if that became a model of everything, but I mean, I've been working I worked for, very early on in my career, I worked for a music company, Same Ash Music, and they were based in New York. And we opened 3 stores in this location, and this was 1999. So we were managing change, navigating a new Oracle system and stuff like that through phone calls. We'd like you said, Ben, we'd huddle around a speakerphone and listen to the Ash family tell us, okay, here's what we're going to be doing, and we're going to change this and do this and whatever, So it's been around for a while. It's just so much. It's just so prevalent now, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And maybe there's some things we could dig into, because Cheryl, you're working on a white paper that we'll push out soon that has to do with signaling, and there's probably a lot that you're just an expert on in terms of signaling in person versus signaling over Zoom versus signaling just on a conference call without video. I don't know. Is that something that maybe you'd want to explore a little bit as part of this remote or hybrid setting?
Absolutely. And if you compare, for example, email systems, right, and that cut us off at the neck essentially because there was no facial expressions. People still have that statement where, oh, I didn't mean that the way it sounded or the way it read, right? And then, so the addition of Zoom and other video conferencing technology enabled us to at least see each other's faces. But there's a whole culture around that too, right? You wouldn't possibly just put your name in there if you had to go and get another cup of coffee if everyone was looking at each other intensely, right? There are cultural norms and things you do and don't do in Zoom because that eye contact, we have grown to be accustomed to that presence, that eye contact, all of those norms that have grown up around it, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm. It's showtime every time we're on the camera.
Right.
Well,
right?
Yeah, and I guess a lot of companies will either ask or request or encourage or require, depending on the level of who's in the room and what the topic is, that you be on camera. And there's some cultural aspects of that, and then there's sort of that, like, who else is in the room, and is this sort of a morning coffee chat or a team meeting, or is it a meeting with the VP kind of thing? But a lot of companies do encourage that camera on because it's easier to make people feel like they're more present.
Yeah, and it's made us
both sides.
Right. See how I'm cutting you off?
Yeah.
If it's the raising your hand and with the technology has made us almost more democratic too, right? You have to wait your turn because now you've got this little hand that, so, that was one of the, for me personally, more difficult because I'll use my whole body to say, I want to interrupt you. And you can't really do that, when you've got your little hand up, so that's been a change in our behavior and our signaling.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you find that there are still people who will interrupt regardless of whether it was the conference call from the 90s or before then?
What are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Where you were in person in meetings, and there's always that person who would just interrupt, cut people off, talk over people, whatever. And do you still see that even over Zoom, that kind of behavior persists? Or do you find less of that because there's more of a culture of raise your hand, it's expected that there's sort of turns, someone's moderating it, as opposed to just the free-for-all?
In my experience, it's been tied to seniority. Honestly, Rich, I don't know about you, but there's a deference to the more senior person.
Do you find that behavior gets better, though, over Zoom, or is it still just senior people cut in regardless?
I think it's better, but it still happens,
Yeah.
For me, it depends on the topic of discussion.
Okay.
So if there's conflict and emotions are running high, people are people, and they'll still chime in and talk over each other. And I've been in meetings where there have been, I don't want to say shouting matches, but people talking over each other until somebody gives in and says, "Okay, you go first," that type of thing. Is it better and less prevalent? Yes, but when the stakes are high, it happens. It continues to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Speaking from experience, just
that makes sense.
I agree with that. Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe let's do this. What do you guys think about taking a quick break? And then when we come back, we can talk a little bit more about signaling over Zoom or in a hybrid environment, and then maybe tie that into some of the stuff that Rich introduced on a prior podcast in terms of communication theory overall, and see how those play together, and then see if we can tie it all together with a nice, pretty bow.
For sure. Love it.
Sounds good.
We'll be right back. Dysfunctional organizational cultures and poorly managed transformations can devastate employee morale and motivation, leading to disengaged employees, poor work quality, and the loss of your best people. The impacts to your organization include high costs, low productivity, and wasted resources. At Harmonious Workplaces, our purpose is to help you build the best workplace possible. We are advisors applying proven organizational development and industrial organizational psychology methodologies to help you become your best organization. We are doers, using time-tested principles to help you execute organizational change initiatives smoothly and successfully. To discover how Harmonious Workplaces can impact your organization, visit www.harmoniousworkplaces.com and book a free 30-minute information session with one of our consultants today. Again, that's www.harmoniousworkplaces.com. And we're back. So we have been talking about managing change in hybrid or remote work environments, and specifically talking about signaling as a kind of an appetizer to the white paper that will be coming out that Cheryl's been working on.
Right.
Sure.
Exactly.
And yes, Ben.
I was just going to say, one of the beautiful things about our conversation so far is we haven't even gotten deep into the change management aspect of it. We actually haven't even scratched the surface. We've been talking a lot about the interaction part of it. The how do you interact with people in a room, on a computer screen? What are some of the differences? And I think that's good because it's so fundamental, and we have to understand that before we can even talk about describing benefits or laying someone off or invoking a change in the organization or whatever that might be, or even just celebrating someone's birthday party over Zoom. We have to understand how this whole mechanism works. So I think that maybe leads us into, Cheryl, probably what you were about to say in terms of signaling, and maybe we could talk about communication theory and things like that.
Well, then
it's been intentional. We haven't totally ignored the change aspect of it.
I was starting to wonder if we could convince our listeners that the topic was always about how there have been changes, really.
Nope.
But I would like to get back to change. I would like to say one, and this is not about change management, but a massive change, and it is related to signaling, and it is this idea of interviewing, right? So you show up in person at an interview, assuming that the hiring manager has read your resume, right? You go signaled that you have degrees, you have finished school, you have work ethic, you have credentials, knowledge, credibility, right? That's all on your resume. You hand that to the hiring manager. So,
and nowadays your LinkedIn profile and your social media posts, I'm sure
all of those
savvy recruiters are looking at all of that.
And then specifically down to the remote situation. So now you're in an interview and it's being recorded, right? So now that conversation has been elevated to a permanent record that will be kept digitally for who knows how long on your performance in an interview where you're already kind of anxious. You don't know what the questions are going to be. There's this asymmetry of information, right? The high
stakes.
The high stakes, all of that. So if that doesn't make you even more nervous, I don't know what will, unless you're a natural performer. And these end up being like pitch videos, right? Which is a whole different industry, you know. So there's all of those things with relation to signaling and how that has been changed with the digital platforms and the remote interaction.
Yeah. It's it really makes the how do I put this? It makes it harder in some ways, I think, to manage expectations when we're in those types of situations, because like I've found that I'm a little more at ease when I have an interview or a consultation or something like that remotely. But when I've been in the other side, where I'm actually like interviewing a prospective employee, or I'm interviewing a prospective vendor, I've seen that throw them off, completely. Where you have to, the nice part about having the video is that you can actually see if somebody feels uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
There are some signals that happen from their body language, from the inflection of their voice, and all that can tell you, hey, something's we got to change the tact, right? And I've just seen more and more of that as we've been using Zoom and Teams and all these other things.
And getting it back to rolling out a change initiative at a company where all the employees are remote, or some, and there's a hybrid. So now you're in a review session for a milestone, for example, and you have to put your work on the screen for everyone to see, right? First of all, you're navigating this. This isn't just coming into a conference room anymore and showing your PowerPoint and pointing to different things and having a conversation. It's sharing your screen. There's your work in all its glory. And everyone, and if you can figure out how to share your screen, if it's not blocked, there's always that awkward moment where not only your
stuff, or you got your echo on or off, and your earbuds and all of that.
We can't hear you, and can you unlock the screen? Right, all of that. Yeah. They're still happening.
You're on mute.
Yeah,
I think you're on mute.
Yeah, and all the signaling that has developed around that, right? That you'll be in a room where everyone has to tell the person, and then maybe just one person just very subtly does this. I try to, for all my hand raising.
That's just what I try to do. Yeah.
Is that the new international symbol for you're on mute? I can't hear you.
Yeah. So there are.
You're firing blanks there today, kid.
Can you imagine if that was part of the just accepted signaling over Zoom?
The lexicon, signaling lexicon.
Call back after you've had your coffee. We can hear you, unfortunately. So change is even harder with the remote situation, but it can also be easier because you can send your work, your slides. You have Asana. You have online milestones. Everyone has the calendar, right? There are a lot of advantages to this too. When someone is in the meeting because they're in the list on the right-hand side of your screen.
Sure.
People can't fake being there anymore over just phone calls. Not that anyone would fake, right? I just suggested one of the biggest problems around it, which is trust, right? Can the employer, can the leaders trust that everyone is doing their best work? And that is still a very volatile conversation, right? Yes, I might be doing my laundry, but it's between my projects, and I am happier because I have my laundry done. Or maybe you don't do your laundry and you're supposed to not leave your desk, right? All those things are still happening.
Do you think there's more trust when you can see someone on the screen?
I think so. I do.
I agree with that. I mean, I think
do you trust me
if we no.
Oh. Do you trust me now?
No.
Do you trust me now?
No.
Do you trust me now?
It's a great point. It's a great point. It brings our entire relationship into question when I just see your little bee and not your face, right? It's like, do I trust that Ben is coming back? Well, it's like object permanence almost, right? What were you going to say?
Where did he go? No. Oh no! Where's Ben?
Well, am I checking the sports scores, or am I doing my laundry or doing the dishes? Right?
Yeah.
Do you hear a toilet flush? Or am I just fixing my makeup, right? I don't know.
Right. And are you paying attention? Are you engaged in what?
I'm sorry, what?
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
I find myself, and I've noticed this too, where in the chat you put BRB or still listening, got to take care of something, or whatever.
But
doing my laundry,
there's
still listening.
Yeah, right. There's still that. What are they really doing? Whatever. So, but like Ben, you were talking about communication theories and
right,
how
because it feels like it's related, right? Signaling, communication theory, trust, presence, all of that.
Absolutely.
And if you're going to try to bring that together in a way that you can do something that is so consequential and so difficult, like rolling out a big change initiative or just managing a change initiative, it seems like you need all of those stars to align. And that's way more than a 40-minute podcast. But it seems like those are themes that we could start bringing together.
Right. Well, if you look at the richness within a communication channel, right? Like how much information is conveyed over a specific channel. For instance, the written word. We just talked about email. If you look at text messaging, right, which used to be only so many characters, right? And how can somebody take the inflection or your word choices or whatever, right? So it is not a very rich form of communication. So it leaves it leaves itself open to a lot of interference between across the channel between the sender, the messenger, and the receiver, right? Whereas, Ben's raising
trying
his
to
hand.
model good behavior here. Isn't that horrible?
I can only see your thumb.
I was curious if you felt like in as unrich as text messaging might be or chat messaging, it seems like it's spawned a whole new linguistic interaction type, though, because you have people who will say something like BRB, like you said before, be right back, or LOL, laugh out loud. And it's like this whole immediate kind of cultural reaction. Someone just throws a smiley face at or a thumbs up in a meeting, and it's a way of interacting that's very quick and very almost intentionally casual, that says we're all sort of friends and part of that in group by doing these things. But it's very different than having a deep, meaningful, like LOL is not going to be super deep and meaningful.
Right. So just briefly on that. So emojis, when I heard that, I think it's Apple that's making it so you can make your own emojis. My first thought was
AI-driven emojis, I think, is a thing now.
My first thought was, won't that fracture the commonality that we have to establish to understand what they mean in the first place? Like
how does that affect the language?
Right. Yeah. So that's a whole nother podcast.
Oof. Yeah. I did not realize that. I mean, I'm just now getting the the laughing, crying emoji. I just elevated to that earlier this week, so and it's only Tuesday.
Oh, can't wait to see which ones you make.
Yeah. So I think there's there is meeting people with the their preferred mode of communication, right? Which if I'm talking to my kids, it drives them crazy when I talk in full sentences on my text message because I'm using the voice, to say something, instead of this,
acronyms,
with my thumbs, right? Yeah, or using acronyms or shortening it up, right? But with video conferencing, right? So let me go to the next one. So we have phones, right? That add a little more richness to what's conveyed. Arguably the most or the richest form of communication is that in person, in the same place, co-located situation, right? But the video conferencing part is very interesting because it it does have a lot of those elements. We can see people, we can see, how they act. We have the voice inflection. And Ben, earlier you talked about, well, you don't have those water cooler talks, but I would actually challenge that a little bit, because with having things like Microsoft Teams, for instance, right? I can get on with one of my colleagues or my employees and say, hey, do you have a second to talk? Maybe go in the conference room or something like that. So, or, a private room or whatever. And we can have this conversation, and it's not quite me being there, but you can be a little more empathetic because you have this ability to see and feel and all that stuff. So
yeah, I love that. That's great.
Yeah. And related are breakout rooms, right? That switches the whole dynamic. And they're like, you haven't moved from your seat, you haven't moved from your screen, and then suddenly the whole mood changes because you're in a breakout room now, right? And it's more intimate and more serious, and you have to engage. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a great point. The whole dynamic from a huge group down to a little tiny breakout room does change the whole dynamic.
Well, we're ready for a break.
I was just going to say, let's take another break. Yeah. And okay, and we'll be right back. At Harmonious Workplaces, we believe work should provide purpose, satisfaction, and growth. We empower people to thrive by fostering environments where individuals can find meaning in their work and organizations can succeed through thoughtful, well-executed strategies. We're committed to making work better for the people who do it and the leaders who guide them. To discover how Harmonious Workplaces can impact your organization, visit www.harmoniousworkplaces.com and book a free 30-minute information session with one of our consultants today. Again, that's www.harmoniousworkplaces.com. And we're back. So we have been talking about managing change in workplaces that are hybrid or remote, and really maybe a little less on change per se, but a lot about how things are communicated.
The different dynamic, that you have with a remote environment or a hybrid environment. Cheryl brought us back to the good old 90s when you had people just conference calls with people halfway across the world, and there was no video, and then we got into video mode and hybridity, and now there's the signaling, there's the communication theory aspect, and we've talked about some of those things in prior episodes. Cheryl's got a white paper coming out that details a lot of information about signaling per se. And I'm wondering if maybe then we take that and we try to bring that to some degree in terms of tips and practicality to companies that are trying to change this new environment that we're in, and say we're going to reel back that whole hybridness, and we're going to try to return to less hybrid and more in person. And whether that might be a good thing or a bad thing, it probably depends on each organization. But I think what I wonder is, are they really thinking through all of those things in terms of the impact to what is a new type of corporate culture, and what people, I think, seems like the data are pointing towards people really treasure this remote flexibility where they can take their kid to school and still be very productive at work, or they can do some laundry over lunch, or they can be a little bit more productive throughout their entire day, recognizing that now their day stretches. It's not just a 9 to 5 clock in, clock out kind of thing, but the flexibility to intermingle. It seems like people find that to be quite a benefit.
And it's enriched the DEI, right? The neurodivergent can be in their homes where their sensory input is managed and controlled, and they can still contribute and the multiple ways that they do.
Right. Or people that are shyer can still participate fully because they raise their hand in meetings, or it's very intentional. You see all these people on a screen and you make sure that you point at each one to offer them a chance to interact. I mean, there's all that.
Right. Yeah. It's remote, but you can be heard and seen more directly.
Right.
Go ahead, Ray. Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to say, and the commute too. I think people really value not having to spend an hour or 2 hours commuting each way.
Listening to podcasts.
Yeah.
Who would do that?
Can't imagine.
Well, now you've made a good argument for going back to work, folks. So you can listen to our podcast every week on your way to work. But I can see to some extent. I'm just going to advocate for the business owners or the executives that make those decisions sometimes, that maybe they're looking for that richer, collaborative experience. I know that's been in some of the literature on, getting people co-located so that, they can do things together. But I would also say maybe they need to look at some of the data about how often. Think about this. How often you're in a Teams meeting, but you're co-located, right? Like how many times are you like
down the hall?
You're down the hall,
yeah.
But you're
still on a Zoom call or a Teams meeting,
or a Teams meeting or whatever, right? So and you could actually do. Some statistics on that, how often are you actually doing that kind of thing? And so does it make sense for us to consider maybe you don't need everybody in every day of the week or something like that?
Or a lot of companies are doing sort of the 2 to 3 days in office, but they make it very intentional so that you have people who are all in on the same day, as opposed to you have to be in the office 3 days, but it could be 3 days that are completely different from other people. So you never wind up having that consistent team on-site. And that's where you're on-site, but you're on a Teams meeting with someone sitting right next to you and 3 other people who are across the country, as opposed to everyone's in on Wednesday. We're going to do all of our teamy stuff on Wednesday, whatever that looks like. That seems like maybe a happier medium.
Right. And then we have the youngest members of the workforce that grew up watching their parents go to offices. They graduated and then they couldn't be in that environment. NPR just had a story about the younger workers who are very excited. Those of them who are going into an office, they see people. The joke was, there's free coffee. I have my own desk, so there's that whole other side of this where there's a longing for that traditional environment and a treasuring of it almost.
Yeah.
There is something to be said for, if we recall back when we were, shut in, right, where we had the lockdown, right? Yeah. People were longing for getting together and meeting. In fact, Ben and I were in this group that meets 3 times a month, IMC USA Chicagoland, right? And during the holidays last year, a bunch of us got together, and it was just refreshing to actually have 3D people, and when I was at the SHRM Chicago Society of Human Resources Management Chicago Elevate conference last week, I think it was. It's already been a week. There's all these people that I've met virtually, but seeing them in person is a totally different experience, So there is something to be said for having, some of that live social, community.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Mm-hmm. And having these options, I think, is the beautiful part about this entire discussion, right? And if individuals have options and each of us get to choose the one that works best for us, that would be the ideal path, right? We're not there yet, right? The pendulum swung way out for the pandemic, and I think it's kind of swung way in the other direction, but I'm optimistic that there will be a middle ground.
But I think Ben, you're well, and Cheryl, saying that it's the intentionality of planning how we're going to get together and make the most out of that. That makes the most sense to me. I recall one time, just a quick. I know we're running up on time here, but I recall just a quick anecdote. I was working with a team we were implementing software for a company. It was a associates management system, and the team was part of the team was based in India, right? But they came into our office. It's a completely different dynamic, right? When we were on team calls or Zoom calls prior, there's a distance of power there to some extent, right? Where sometimes it was almost cold how we would talk to each other. It's just very businesslike. But when we got together, I remember going and sharing a meal and actually sharing with each other how our families and this and that, the things that were not as work related. Our relationship.
There's something about breaking bread with people that changes a work relationship. It's really magical.
It is.
Agreed.
It is. Yeah. So,
in terms
where do we go with this?
Yeah, no, just in terms of practicality and takeaways, I think we've talked about some of the intentionality about using Zoom and getting the best out of hybrid type environments, understanding the maybe constraints or the gotchas around these types of things, giving people a little bit of grace if their technology doesn't work or if they need help coming off of mute or whatever, helping them figure that out. And then also thinking pretty carefully about if you do have some sort of forced in person, how do you make that work in a good way so that it still allows everybody to contribute across the spectrum of personalities and locations and things like that.
Well, I'm going to give the signal.
Ding, 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 ding.
That we've come up on time. Yeah. So I'm sure we'll be continuing to talk about remote work, hybrid work, and how we navigate this landscape in the future.
Not to put
there's so much.
Not to put too fine a point on it, but the three of us have never been in the same room.
That is true, and two of us live in the same vicinity.
And it hasn't set us back, not a bit.
Not a bit. Right
on. Cool.
Well, who wants to take us out today?
I do.
There you go. Awesome.
Thank you so much, Rich, Ben, and all our listeners. And don't forget, make change your friend.
Thanks for listening to Harmonious Workplaces. You can find Harmonious Workplaces on LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, Spotify, Amazon, Apple, and other streaming platforms. We'd love any feedback on whatever channel you find us on. Please rate, like, and share our podcast with your network, and remember to add Harmonious Workplaces to your list of favorites to get notified about each new episode. To contact Rich or Cheryl, please visit www.workbalanceconsulting.com. To connect with Ben, find him on LinkedIn or visit at www.harborsidestrategy.com.